Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Murder, She Meowed by Ruth J. Hartman. And this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. When I glanced down at my cats, Milton and Pearl, my heart nearly melted. Milton, already looking like he was wearing a tuxedo with his black and white fur, now sported a red bow tie that contrasted nicely with his round green eyes. His sister Pearl, with her long all-white fur, looked regal on any given day. Today, however, the tiny pink veil she wore that came down to just above her green eyes gave her an ethereal presence normally reserved for royalty. The third cat, who sat with them in the wagon, King, wasn't mine, but belonged to Wallace, who my Aunt Betty was just about to marry. For the moment, my cats, who normally got along for the most part, weren't having cat spats with King, although the generous amount of catnip I gave them a few minutes ago might have something to do with that. Their wagon was situated at the back of the sanctuary in the open doorway to the lobby. Their driver, the one pulling their wagon down the aisle, would be Elliot Wilkins, Wallace's nephew. Really nice guy, attractive and sweet, but I only had eyes for Micah, a local ER doctor. I glanced behind me when I heard the tapping of high heels on the wooden floor. My friend Janie approached, all smiles for the wedding day. Janie, my blonde, blue-eyed, funny, sweet, extremely clingy friend. Would it be wrong for me to play matchmaker between her and Elliot? I grinned. No, never wrong. I'd have to give that some thought later after today's festivities were over. Janie waved, then took a seat near the back of the sanctuary since she'd have to slip out and get to Perked Up, Wallace's Cafe, where she would help host the reception using a cake she'd made in her pastry shop, Dreamy Sweets. Aunt Betty had requested that I sit in the front row so I'd be near her. Other than the cats, Aunt Betty and Wallace weren't having anyone stand up with them. Although the cats would hopefully be asleep in their wagon by then. I glanced at my watch, realized I'd better get moving, then stepped onto the aisle that ran down the middle of the small church Aunt Betty and I attended each Sunday. As I passed Janie's row, I glanced at her, ready to wave. But the look of absolute horror on her face stopped me cold. The organ music began, and a quick glimpse behind me showed Aunt Betty and Elliot pulling the wagon, ready to walk down the aisle. I had to move. With haste, careful not to trip, stumble, or plain out fall, all of which weren't that uncommon for me, I reached the front pew, plopped down on the seat, and tried to catch my breath. That was close, because now my aunt and her soon-to-be nephew were coming down the aisle straight toward me. Aunt Betty's brown eyes glowed with happiness. Her short gray hair wasn't covered by a veil, but instead she wore a ring of baby's breath around her head. The effect was beautiful. As soon as my aunt and Elliot were standing in front of the minister, I dared a glance toward Janie. She still wore that awful expression from before. What was going on? Maybe she'd forgotten an ingredient in the wedding cake and just now realized it, or had neglected to brush her teeth. Or perhaps she didn't want to sit all the way in the back when I was in front. She did have a friendly attachment to me, after all, and I do mean attachment. Most times when I saw her, she either hugged me, clung to my arm, or grabbed my hand. When we'd been little girls, that had been fun and sweet. Now I tolerated it because I truly liked her. I just had to put up with having a cute blonde appendage most of the time. But finding out why she was so upset right now would have to wait until the reception. I focused on the couple in front of me. Wallace, looking dashing in his tuxedo, his short dark hair recently trimmed, had taken Elliot's place next to Aunt Betty and gazed at her, love apparent in his blue eyes. My aunt's cheeks were pink and not from too much blush. Was she embarrassed to be the center of attention? She never liked that. She'd always preferred to work behind the scenes like she did in her bookstore, Words to Read By. While she adored her work and the customers, she made it her mission to allow me to be in the limelight by touting my line of children's mysteries based on Milton and Pearl's adventures as feline sleuths. Too bad I didn't feel comfortable being the center of attention either. But I adored my aunt, and I loved working for her. If she wanted to shower me with attention, who was I to complain? The Kitties' wagon had been rolled close to where I sat so as not to be a stumbling block for Aunt Betty or Wallace when it was time to return down the aisle as a married couple. It was especially important for Wallace as he had an illness called tardive dyskinesia. Because of it, he often jerked, trembled, or tripped and lost his balance. I reached out and ran my fingers through Pearl's fur, then Milton's, earning me gentle purrs and head nudges. They were both sleepy from the catnip, squinting their eyes nearly closed and touching my fingers with their paws. King, however, didn't seem to have been affected as much by the catnip. It was hard to tell with cats which ones would succumb or not. He wasn't causing a ruckus, thankfully, but neither was he totally subdued, his tail twitching every few seconds. When I laid my hand on his side to calm him, he let out a loud, long hiss. I guess I'd upset him instead of comforted him. Wallace, eyes wide, glanced over his shoulder at his cat. Wallace then eyed me. I shrugged. He shrugged. And then he returned his attention to the pastor. Aunt Betty hadn't made eye contact with me, but her shoulders were now bunched up closer to her ears. It was a sure sign she'd heard the hiss and was nervous about something further happening with cats. I knew the ceremony would be brief. That's how Aunt Betty wanted it. Since she and Wallace had both been married before, they wanted it simple and short. Still, I held my breath, hoping King would behave until it was through. The vows had been made, the rings exchanged. I let out a breath. Almost there. Now, if King would only... His large gray striped form leaped out of the wagon, hissed at me again for a good measure, and took off like a shot back up the aisle. Aunt Betty's eyes were huge. I gave her a thumbs up and raced up the aisle, past friends, neighbors, and some guy sitting in the back pew I'd never seen before. Just as I dove on top of King to subdue him, the pastor announced, "Allow me to introduce Mr. and Mrs. Wallace Wilkins." The applause that followed, thankfully, covered my yelp of pain as King stuck a well-placed claw into my thumb. However, I had him tightly pressed against my chest and would be finding his carrier as soon as possible. I glanced around the lobby, then saw it in a corner, half hidden behind a large fern. When I approached the carrier, King didn't squirm but flopped dejectedly in my arms as if knowing he'd go in it whether he wanted to or not. I was grateful Elliot had volunteered to cat sit for King while the honeymooners went on their short trip. I would have taken him, but knew with my two plus him it would have been a big furry handful. Milton and Pearl were challenging enough on their own. Aunt Betty and Wallace stepped into the lobby and headed toward one end of the area to greet their guests and well-wishers. I was sure my aunt would have a few things to say about King's behavior at the wedding, but for now, she was otherwise occupied. Guests soon followed, creating a line to speak to the bride and groom. With King securely sulking in his carrier, I waved over at Elliot as he emerged from the sanctuary. "Your new roommate is pouting in his unwanted enclosure," I said, pointing toward the fern. Elliot grinned. "Your sprint down the aisle after him was quite impressive." I smirked. "Thanks a lot." "No, really, thanks for taking the hit of subduing him. When I saw him streak by, I was ready to go after him, but you were practically on his tail, so you saved me the trouble." Janie rushed out of the sanctuary, hurried over to me, and grabbed my arm tightly against her. She leaned over and whispered, "I can't believe he's here." Surely she didn't mean Elliot. "Who are you talking about?" She tilted her head toward the sanctuary. "You know, him." Did she mean the guy sitting in back, the one I didn't know? Elliot's eyebrows rose, but he said nothing. I glanced from Elliot to Janie and back. They were now eyeing each other. I took the plunge. "Hey, have you guys officially met?" Elliot, fairly new to town, shook his head. "No, haven't had the pleasure." Janie's pale cheeks reddened. No. "I'm Janie." "Elliot." He stuck out his hand. Janie had to disentangle herself from my arm to shake his hand. It was a relief for me as her grip had been cutting off my circulation. Janie smiled at Elliot for a few seconds, then gasped. I frowned at her. "What's wrong?" "I need to go. Time to finish up last-minute details at the reception." As she dashed toward the exit, she called over her shoulder, "Nice to meet you, Elliot." Micah was at the tail end of the guests streaming from the sanctuary. As I studied him, tall with broad shoulders, brown eyes and hair, and an infectious smile, my palms began to sweat. Had someone turned up the thermostat in here? I sighed. No, it was just my normal reaction to him. He approached me, said hello, then stuck out his hand to Elliot. "We haven't officially met. I'm Micah Remington." "Elliot Wilkins. Glad to meet you." A loud growl came from King. Micah's eyebrows lowered. "Did that fern just make a noise?" "Oh," said Elliot. "That's King. Let me run him to my apartment and get him settled before I head to the reception." Poor guy's angry that he's stuck in the carrier. Turned away, picked up the growling cat, and left the building. Micah tilted his head toward the exit. "Seems like a good guy." "Yeah, I think he is. From what Aunt Betty told me, he's only recently moved to Green Meadow. He's the new pharmacist taking over for Andy Holmes, who's retiring." Guess he and I will cross paths then in our official capacities, said Micah. Yep, I said. Aunt Betty was giving me the eye from across the room. Listen, I need to check on my aunt. See you at the reception? You bet. The line of guests was dwindling. I angled around the people to step beside Aunt Betty. She squeezed my hand. My goodness, are you all right, Christy? I gave a shrug. I'm fine, just glad I caught King before he got too far away. Wallace grimaced. Sorry about that, ladies. My cat is normally a good guy, but can be a little spicy when the mood strikes. He looked at his new wife. I hope it didn't spoil your special day, Betty. She waved her hand. Ah, not at all. We'll just add to the memories of the day. I kissed my aunt's cheek, then Wallace's. Congratulations, you two. Aunt Betty smiled. Thank you, love. Suddenly, I remembered the guy sitting in back who I hadn't recognized. Hey, who was that 30-something guy sitting in back? Wallace sighed. Oh, him. Well, that was a distant cousin of mine. Aunt Betty piped up. And who wasn't on the invitation list. I know, said Wallace. I'm sorry about that. No, said Aunt Betty. I didn't mean anything about you. I was just surprised to see someone there who I didn't know well. I have no idea why he's here, he said. I haven't spoken to him in quite a while. When Wallace noticed another person walking over to congratulate them, he smiled and stuck out his hand to a man I recognized as having stopped into Words to Read by a couple of times. As Aunt Betty prepared to greet the man, I leaned over to her and whispered, If you don't need anything right now, I'll head on over to Perked Up and see if Janie needs any help. I'm fine, and thank you, she said. Milton and Pearl were still snoozing in the wagon. They'd slept through the entire wedding, including King's sudden departure. I grabbed their leashes that I'd stashed on a shelf above a nearby coat rack, picked up my adorable sleepyheads, and headed out. When I arrived at Perked Up, Janie was indeed in a frenzy. Couldn't figure out why, because everything was there, including her cake, the plates, utensils, napkins, along with charcuterie boards with meat, cheese, and veggies supplied by Annabelle Engstrom and her assistant Bernie Inman from Annabelle's Market. I clipped Milton and Pearl's leashes on them and set them on the floor. I would have taken the cats to the apartment like Elliot had done with King, but Aunt Betty had been adamant that I bring them. She'd grown so attached to them during the time we'd all shared an apartment, and she wanted them there on her special day. Hopefully, in time, she'd grow close to King as well, since she'd be her cat now as well as Wallace's. As I reached Janie, I eyed her. Her cheeks were flushed and her apron was slightly askew. Janie, are you all right? Her hands fluttered like a couple of nervous hummingbirds. It's just terrible. With a glance at the beautiful table, I said, I think it's perfect. Aunt Betty and Wallace will love it. What? Janie frowned. Oh, no, not the food. Then what? Janie eyed her assistant, Kirsten, who was standing nearby. With a tilt of her head, Janie had me follow her to a corner. Did she not want Kirsten to hear us? I gently tugged Milton and Pearl's leashes, and they trotted along beside me until I reached Janie. If it's not the food that has you upset, what's going on? Janie looked over my shoulder and gasped. I can't believe it. He has some nerve to show up here, too. I checked over my shoulder to see the man I'd spotted at the wedding, the one who was apparently Wallace's distant relation. The guy was tall and fit, with short blonde hair and narrow blue eyes that scanned the room. Looking back at Janie, I said, So you know him? Do I ever? Her mouth turned down at the corners. That is none other than Tad Miles, my despicable ex-husband. My mouth dropped open. Why is he here? I'd rather not know. Never thought I'd have to lay eyes on him again. Since I'd only recently come to live permanently in Green Meadow, I'd never seen her ex before. When I was little, I used to visit Aunt Betty every summer. That's how I'd met Janie. We'd seen each other for several summers, but as adults, we drifted apart. Now that I was living here, we'd started up our friendship again. I was so glad. Seconds later, Kirsten shrieked and stomped her foot. Her green eyes blazed as she flipped her reddish-brown hair over her shoulder. Uh-oh, said Janie. My assistant is in some sort of mood. I better get over there and smooth things out. With your ex here, are you sure you're ready to tackle Kirsten's mood too? I have to be, she said. I'm here on a job, and even though I hate the fact that Tad showed up, I have to do my work to the best of my ability. I reached out and touched her arm. And I have no doubt you'll do it wonderfully, like you always do. Janie gave a small smile and headed back to the refreshment table. Others began to enter Perked Up from the wedding venue. Some took places at nearby tables, while others stood around chatting with friends. Micah came in and headed across the room toward me. He pointed down. I wasn't sure the cats ate wedding cake. I grinned. These two? They'll eat anything they can get away with. I angled my head toward Tad, who leaned against the opposite wall drinking a glass of champagne. I just found out he's Janie's ex, I said. The food and drink hadn't been officially served yet because Janie had wanted to wait until the bride and groom had arrived. They were still at the church having a few pictures taken. Had Tad simply helped himself to a drink? Kirsten stood behind the refreshment table, glaring in Pat's direction. Was she upset about someone stealing a drink early, or just upset on Janie's behalf? Micah shook his head when he glanced at Tad. Yeah, I remember Tad. None of those memories are positive. Put Janie through a whole lot. My heart broke for my friend. She'd never said much about her ex. I figured that, like me with mine, talking about hers was probably too painful, so I never asked. Along with working part-time at the school as a counselor, said Micah, Tad had also worked as a psychologist at the hospital before he left town. But he caused a lot of people major problems. The main door opened again, and Aunt Betty and her new husband entered. A cheer went up around the room as they moved to stand behind the wedding cake. As the photographer got his camera ready, Aunt Betty and Wallace fed each other small bites of their cake, causing a round of applause from their guests. People lined up to be served refreshments and settle at places to sit and enjoy the food. I waited while other guests got their food. I'd get mine in a few minutes. Micah stayed with me. You know, he said, I'm shocked Tad is here. I can't imagine his reason for coming back to town. Wallace told me that Tad is a distant relative, but they weren't close at all. Even so, he wreaked havoc while he lived here. I doubt there's anybody who's glad to see him, especially Janie, he said. Janie stood behind the cake, serving the guests in line. Wallace and Aunt Betty had relocated to a specially decorated table in the center of the room as they ate cake and toasted each other with champagne. Janie wore a smile, but I knew it wasn't real. I could tell she was seething just below the surface because Tad was here. Micah pointed toward the table. Looks like everyone else has gone through. Ready for some cake? Sure. When I took a step, Pearl and then Milton followed, meowing louder the nearer we got to the table. Realizing they might want a snack too, I had Micah take the leashes, reached into my purse for a small plastic bag, and retrieved a few treats. We paused near the table for the cats to munch, and then I pulled out one of the chairs while Micah got our refreshments. As I sat down and got the cats settled at my feet, I wished Micah and I had come to the wedding together as a couple. Maybe someday. As soon as we'd eaten, Micah pointed to a man across the room who'd just entered. I see a colleague from work. I think I'll go over and say hello. Okay, I said. I needed to mingle a little anyway. As I made my way across the room, I noticed Kirsten headed out the door. Usually she was required to stay and help as long as Janie was at a function, but why was she leaving so early? Before I could see Janie again to ask, I stopped to speak to Annabelle. Hi, I said. Nice to see you. Thanks for providing the charcuterie board. The food was great. Thank you, she said, but her smile didn't reach her brown eyes. Is everything all right? I asked. No, it isn't. I'm so worried about my daughter. She has something awful going on, some terrible decisions to make. Annabelle started to cry. I don't know what she's going to do. She wiped the tears from her cheeks. Sorry to burden you with this. I need to leave now. Annabelle collected her purse and jacket, then spoke to her assistant, making sure he would put the rest of the food out before leaving. Concerned, I watched her go. Poor woman. How hard it must be for her to watch her family suffer and not be able to help. Movement from my left caught my attention. When I turned, Annabelle's assistant, Bernie, a tall, brown-eyed man with dark hair, stood watching the door swing shut after Annabelle had left. After a few seconds, he tidied up the area, then replenished the charcuterie board with food. With a glance around the room, he grabbed his jacket, and then he too left the reception. I knew that Janie had hired them to supply the food, but she and Kirsten were serving and cleaning up afterward, or at least Janie was, since Kirsten had walked out. Wanting to greet some of the other guests before they left the premises, I said hello to several people I recognized. A woman I'd seen before but had never met stood alone by an empty table. I introduced myself. It was then I noticed her hand was shaking so hard she'd spilled part of her punch onto the floor but didn't seem to notice. She blinked rapidly as if warding off tears. I glanced at the floor. Don't worry about that. We'll clean it up later. Is there something I can do for you? Would you like to sit down? She finally focused on me, then nodded. I placed her glass on the table, helped her get settled, then sat across the table from her, the cat sitting near my feet. I'm sorry, she said. It's nice to meet you. I'm Felicia Vale. She reached up and smoothed her short, dark hair. I recognize you from words to read by. I teach at the elementary school. I didn't think he'd show up in town again. She tilted her head to someone across the room. I angled around to look. Had she meant Tad? Right then, Tad's voice grew loud behind us. When I glanced at him again, I could see he was acting as if he'd had way too much champagne. Why did he have to spoil Aunt Betty's reception by acting like a jerk? Micah rushed over and had a quiet word with Tad, who shook his head, then stood so quickly his chair tumbled backwards. Tad then stormed from the room. Well, perfect. Would Aunt Betty and Wallace take offense? A few minutes later, my aunt came over and gave me a huge hug. Thank you, love, for such a lovely wedding and reception. Wallace and I are ready to go and start our trip, but I'll see you soon, right? I kissed her cheek, glad she didn't seem upset by Tad or anyone else's behavior. Yes, soon. Take care and have fun. With a smile, she left and joined Wallace at the door, both waving to everyone before they stepped through the doorway. Seeing that everyone else had finished their refreshments and were ready to go, I went to Janie to help her clear up what was left of the cake and drinks. As soon as items were boxed up and ready to be carried out of Perked Up, Micah and I, along with Milton and Pearl, helped Janie transport everything back to her shop during these suites. It had been a long, busy day. I'd be glad to get back to the apartment with the cats and curl up in bed for a rest. After Janie unlocked the shop's door and reached in to flip on the lights, we all stepped inside. Milton and Pearl immediately hissed, their fur puffing out to twice its normal size. We all froze because lying on the floor was Janie's rolling pin, and next to it was Tad, covered in blood, and appearing to be very, very dead.